So, here is something worth sitting with for a moment before you drift off tonight. Right now, somewhere in the world, hundreds of nuclear reactors are quietly running in the background of ordinary life. They are heating water, turning turbines, sending electricity into cities, hospitals, homes, trains, factories, and small glowing screens beside people's beds. Most of the time, nobody thinks about them. And in a strange way, that is exactly what a successful power plant is supposed to do. It is supposed to disappear. It is supposed to become nothing more than a light switching on, a phone charging, a refrigerator humming softly in the kitchen. When nuclear power works, it feels almost invisible. But every so often, something goes wrong. And when something goes wrong inside a nuclear reactor, the world suddenly remembers that this quiet source of electricity is built around one of the most powerful forces human beings have ever learned to control. The story of nuclear disasters is not really a story about monsters, or mysterious machines, or science fiction nightmares. It is a story about people. People making decisions with incomplete information. People trusting instruments that did not tell the whole truth. People working inside systems where pressure, pride, secrecy, cost, and habit slowly shaped what they were willing to see. And again, the same pattern appears. A warning sign is missed. A risk is underestimated. A design flaw is treated as manageable. A safety feature that seems unnecessary is ignored. A procedure is rushed because the system has become too confident. Tonight, we are going to walk slowly through that history. We will begin with the atom itself, because you cannot understand what goes wrong in a nuclear reactor unless you first understand what is supposed to go right. Then we will move through the early years of nuclear energy, the first controlled chain reaction, and the first lessons that came at a terrible cost. We will visit a small military reactor in Idaho, a burning graphite pile on the coast of England, a control room in Pennsylvania filled with alarms, a reactor in northern Ukraine that tore itself apart in the middle of the night, and a coastal power station in Japan where the earthquake was survived, but the ocean was not. And by the end, maybe the story will feel a little different from the one most people imagine. Because the history of nuclear disasters is not only a history of failure, it is also a history of learning, of painful corrections, of humility, of discovering again and again that the most dangerous part of any complex technology is not always the machine itself. Sometimes it is the assumption that we understand it completely. So, let's begin quietly with the atom. For most of human history, the atom was not something anyone could see or measure. It was an idea. Ancient thinkers imagined that if you kept cutting matter into smaller and smaller pieces, eventually, you would reach something that could not be cut any further. They called it atomos, uncuttable. For centuries, that was mostly philosophy. Then, near the end of the 19th century, scientists began discovering that atoms were not simple at all. They had structure. They had parts. They behaved in ways no one expected. In 1896, Henri Becquerel noticed that uranium salts were giving off invisible radiation all by themselves. They did not need sunlight. They did not need heat. Something inside the atoms was releasing energy on its own. Marie Curie and Pierre Curie studied this strange phenomenon and gave it a name: radioactivity. At first, nobody understood what it meant. Then Ernest Rutherford showed that atoms had a nucleus, a tiny, dense center where almost all the mass was concentrated, and this created a deeper mystery. If the nucleus contained positively charged protons and positive charges repel each other, why did the nucleus not simply fly apart? Something incredibly powerful had to be holding it together. Today we call that force, the strong nuclear force. It works only over distances so tiny that they are almost impossible to imagine. But within that tiny space, it is stronger than anything else in nature. And if that nucleus could be split, some of the energy holding it together could be released. This is where Einstein's famous idea about mass and energy becomes more than an equation on a blackboard. When a heavy atom like uranium splits, the two smaller pieces weigh slightly less than the original atom. That missing mass has become energy. The amount of missing mass is tiny, but the energy is enormous, millions of times greater than the energy released by ordinary chemical reactions like burning coal or gasoline. The key that opened the door was the neutron. In 1932, James Chadwick discovered that the nucleus contained particles with no electrical charge. Because neutrons were neutral, they could slip into the nucleus without being pushed away by electrical repulsion. A neutron could enter a uranium atom, and sometimes, when it did, the uranium atom would split. In December of 1938, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann bombarded uranium with neutrons and found something astonishing in the aftermath. Barium, an element much lighter than uranium. That meant the uranium atom had not merely changed slightly. It had split almost in half. Lise Meitner and Otto Frisch worked out the explanation. They realized the nucleus had divided and that a tremendous amount of energy had been released. Frisch borrowed a word from biology to describe it. Fission. Nuclear fission. But fission had one more detail that changed everything. When a uranium-235 atom splits, it does not only release energy, it also releases more neutrons. Those neutrons can strike more uranium atoms. Those atoms split, releasing still more neutrons, and suddenly, you have a chain reaction. Control that chain reaction and you have a reactor. Let it run away uncontrolled and you have a bomb. That was the fork in the road. One path led to weapons. The other led to electricity. The first controlled, self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction happened on December 2nd, 1942, beneath the stands of a squash court at the University of Chicago. Enrico Fermi and his team built what they called an atomic pile. It was made of uranium and graphite blocks stacked together. The graphite slowed the neutrons down, because slower neutrons are better at causing uranium-235 atoms to split. To control the reaction, they used cadmium rods. Cadmium absorbs neutrons. Push the rods in and the reaction slows down. Pull them out and the reaction speeds up. That is the basic principle behind every nuclear reactor ever built. A reactor is a machine for managing neutrons. More neutrons, more fission, more heat. Fewer neutrons, less fission, less heat. At 3:25 in the afternoon, Fermi's pile became self-sustaining. The neutron count rose steadily and kept rising. The reactor produced only about half a watt of power, barely enough to light a small bulb. But it proved that controlled nuclear energy was possible. And yet, by modern standards, the experiment was almost unbelievable. There was no containment building, no real cooling system, very little shielding. And the emergency backup plan was a man standing nearby with a bucket of cadmium solution, ready to pour it over the pile if something went wrong. They called that group the Suicide Squad. That detail tells us something important about the early nuclear age. The scientists were brilliant, but they were also moving fast under wartime pressure, working with a technology no human being had ever handled before. Safety existed, but it had not yet become a culture. That tension between urgency and caution would follow nuclear power for decades. After the war, the world had already seen what uncontrolled fission could do at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But controlled fission promised something else entirely: electricity, heat without smoke, power from a small amount of fuel. A single pound of uranium-235, fully fissioned, could release as much energy as millions of pounds of coal. The basic idea of a nuclear power plant is simple. A reactor produces heat. The heat boils water. Steam turns a turbine. The turbine spins a generator. Electricity flows out. In that sense, a nuclear plant is a very complicated way to boil water. But the heat source is not like coal, oil, or gas. It is a chain reaction inside radioactive fuel. And that changes everything. You must control the reaction, cool the fuel, shield the workers, contain the radioactive materials, and prepare for the possibility that every ordinary system might fail. In the early years, different countries chose different reactor designs. The United States favored light water reactors, using ordinary water as both coolant and moderator. The British built gas-cooled, graphite-moderated reactors. The Canadians developed heavy water reactors. The Soviet Union built the RBMK, a large graphite-moderated, water-cooled reactor that was powerful, cheap to build, and capable of being refueled while running. Each design had advantages, each had weaknesses, and each had its own way of failing. But before the great public accidents of 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima, there were earlier warnings. The first one we need to sit with happened in the cold desert of Idaho, January 3, 1961. The reactor was called SL-1, short for Stationary Low Power, Reactor Number 1. It was not a large commercial power plant. It was a small military reactor designed to provide heat and power for remote bases, places like Arctic radar stations. On that winter night, 3 young military operators were preparing the reactor for restart after a holiday shutdown. They were supposed to reconnect the control rod drive mechanisms manually. One of the operators, Richard Legg, withdrew the central control rod. He was supposed to pull it only a few inches. Instead, it came out about 20 inches in one rapid motion. And that was enough. In that small reactor, with that particular design, withdrawing the central rod so far introduced too much reactivity too quickly. The reactor went prompt critical in about 4 milliseconds. 4/1000ths of a second. There was no time for a person to react. The water inside the reactor flashed instantly into steam. The pressure surge was so violent that it launched the entire reactor vessel upward. All 3 men were killed. One was pinned to the ceiling by a control rod. The others died from the force of the explosion and radiation exposure. The aftermath was grim and quiet. The bodies were so radioactive that recovery workers could approach only for short periods of time. It took days to recover them. Some remains were treated as radioactive waste. The men were buried in lead-lined caskets. The investigation never fully answered why the rod was pulled so far. Maybe it stuck because of corrosion, then came loose suddenly. Maybe there was some human factor that will never be known. But from an engineering point of view, the lesson was brutally clear. No reactor should be designed so that one control rod, moved by one person, can destroy the system. No single mistake should be able to produce the worst possible outcome. That lesson became part of a larger idea called defense in depth. One barrier is not enough. One safety system is not enough. One operator action cannot be the difference between normal operation and disaster. You need layers. You need backup systems. You need designs that expect humans to make mistakes. SL-1 did not become famous in the way Chernobyl did. It did not reshape public opinion around the world, but inside the nuclear community, it left a mark. It forced engineers to ask a question that would never go away. How much can you trust the human in the loop? Because reactors are designed by humans, built by humans, operated by humans, regulated by humans, and humans get tired. They misread things. They work under pressure. They assume that today will be like yesterday. The next warning came from Britain. The place was Windscale on the northwest coast of England. The year was 1957. Windscale was not built primarily to generate electricity. It was built to produce plutonium for Britain's nuclear weapons program. The Cold War was deepening, and Britain wanted to prove it could stand as a nuclear power. The facility had two air-cooled, graphite-moderated reactors called piles. Graphite was used to slow neutrons, but graphite has a strange property. When it is bombarded by neutrons over time, atoms inside its crystal structure get knocked out of place. Energy becomes stored in the graphite, almost like a compressed spring. This stored energy is called Wigner energy. If it builds up too much and releases suddenly, the graphite can heat dangerously. To prevent this, operators carried out a process called annealing. They deliberately heated the graphite so the displaced atoms could settle back into place and release the stored energy in a controlled way. But in the 1950s, this process was still not fully understood. It was part science, part experience, and part educated guesswork. On October 10, 1957, operators began an annealing cycle in Windscale pile number 1. The first heating did not seem to work properly. The temperature readings did not show what they expected, so they decided to heat the reactor again. But the temperature sensors were not placed in the hottest parts of the core. The instruments were telling them the graphite was not hot enough. In reality, some parts were already much too hot. When they added more heat, those hot areas became hotter still. Eventually, uranium fuel cartridges inside the reactor caught fire, inside the core. And because Windscale was air-cooled, air was being blown through the reactor. The fire had oxygen. Radioactive tellurium began flowing out through the air system and up the chimney stack. For many hours, the operators did not fully understand what was happening. The readings were confusing. Temperatures rose in strange ways. Then someone looked through an inspection port and saw the red glow of burning fuel. The reactor core was on fire. The response became desperate and improvised. They tried pushing burning fuel cartridges out of the reactor with long rods. In some places, that made the fire worse by allowing more air into the core. They tried carbon dioxide to smother the flames. It was not enough. Finally, Tom Twoohey, the deputy general manager, made the decision everyone feared: use water. Putting water on a burning reactor was frightening because, under certain conditions, water hitting very hot metal can produce hydrogen. Hydrogen mixed with air can explode, but the fire was still burning. Radioactive material was still escaping, so they turned on the hoses. Slowly, the water worked. The fire went out. Pile number 1 was destroyed and never operated again. Pile number 2 was shut down and never restarted. In the surrounding countryside, milk from farms across a large area was collected and dumped because it contained iodine-131, a radioactive isotope that can concentrate in the thyroid. Publicly, the British government downplayed the accident. Politically, the timing was sensitive. Britain was trying to maintain its nuclear image and secure cooperation with the United States. The full truth remained partly hidden for decades, but one detail from Windscale stands out as strangely hopeful. When the piles were being designed, a physicist named John Cockcroft insisted that large filters be installed at the top of the exhaust stacks. Many people thought they were unnecessary. They were expensive, they seemed excessive. Some called them Cockcroft's follies. But during the fire, those filters those filters trapped a significant amount of radioactive material that otherwise would have gone straight into the atmosphere. The safety feature people had mocked as overkill turned out to be one of the things that prevented the accident from becoming far worse. That lesson echoes through the entire history of nuclear power. The safety systems that seem unnecessary are often the ones you are most grateful for on the one day they are needed. By the 1960s and 1970s, commercial nuclear power was expanding quickly. Reactors were becoming larger. Plants were being built to produce hundreds, then thousands, of megawatts. And as reactors grew, engineers focused on one terrifying question: what happens if the core loses cooling? This is the heart of so many nuclear accidents. A reactor can be shut down. The control rods can be inserted. The chain reaction can stop. But the fuel does not instantly become cold. Inside the fuel are fission products, unstable atoms created when uranium split. These atoms continue to decay, and as they decay, they release heat. This is called decay heat. Right after shutdown, decay heat can still be several percent of full reactor power. That may sound small, but in a large power reactor, a few percent can still mean tens of megawatts of heat. Heat that cannot be switched off. Heat that must be removed. If cooling stops, the water around the fuel begins to boil. If the fuel rods become exposed, their metal cladding heats up. At high temperatures, the zirconium alloy around the fuel can react with steam and produce hydrogen. The fuel can break, then melt. And if the melted fuel cannot be contained, radioactive material can escape. So engineers developed emergency core cooling systems, backup pumps, high-pressure injection, water tanks, systems designed to flood the core if normal cooling failed. But in the early decades, many of these systems had never been tested at full scale under real accident conditions. The models were imperfect. The computers were primitive. The physical behavior of water, steam, pressure, and fuel during a major accident was extremely complex. And then, on March 28, 1979, at 4 in the morning, the question became real. 3 Mile Island Unit 2, near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The reactor had been operating commercially for only about 3 months. The accident began on the non-nuclear side of the plant. A problem in the secondary cooling system caused pumps to stop feeding water to the steam generators. The reactor automatically shut down. The control rods inserted. The chain reaction stopped. At first, the safety system did exactly what it was supposed to do. But because heat was no longer being carried away properly, pressure began rising in the primary cooling system. A relief valve opened to reduce the pressure. That was normal. The valve was supposed to close again. It did not. It stuck open. Hot, pressurized water from the reactor coolant system began escaping. This was a loss of coolant accident, but the operators did not know it. On their control panel, they had an indicator showing that the signal to close the valve had been sent. The signal had been sent, but the valve itself was still open. There was no direct indicator showing its real physical position. So the operators believed the valve was closed. Water was leaving the reactor, but the control room did not make that clear. The emergency core cooling system started pumping water into the reactor. For a moment, the backup system was doing the right thing. But the instruments seemed to show that the pressurizer level was rising. To the operators, that looked like the system had too much water. In reality, steam formation was creating a misleading reading. The system was losing water, but the instruments suggested the opposite. So the operators did the thing that made sense to them at the time. They reduced emergency cooling. They turned off the very system that was trying to save the core. This is the central tragedy of 3 Mile Island. The operators were not villains. They were not trying to be reckless. They were trained people under pressure, facing confusing information from a control room that did not help them understand what was really happening. More than 100 alarms went off in the first minutes. The control room was full of noise, but noise is not the same as understanding. Inside the reactor, the water level dropped. Fuel rods were uncovered. The exposed fuel overheated. Zirconium reacted with steam, producing hydrogen. About half of the core melted. Molten fuel slumped toward the bottom of the reactor vessel. For a time, nobody fully understood how badly damaged the core was. The good news, and it matters, is that the containment building held. The thick steel and concrete structure around the reactor did what it was designed to do. Some radioactive gases were released, but the doses to the public were small. Later studies did not find a significant increase in cancer rates around the plant. Physically, the public health impact was limited. Psychologically and politically, the impact was enormous. People were frightened. Officials gave confusing information. More than 100,000 people left the area, many voluntarily. Pregnant women and small children were advised to evacuate within 5 miles. The accident came just days after the release of a movie about a fictional nuclear power plant accident and cover-up. Public trust collapsed. But 3 Mile Island also forced real changes. The Kameni Commission found that the deeper problem was not just a stuck valve. It was training, control room design, procedures, communication, the relationship between humans and complex machines. Before 3 Mile Island, nuclear safety had focused heavily on hardware. Pumps, pipes, valves, containment. After 3 Mile Island, the industry had to admit that operators were parts of the system too. And if the system confused them, overwhelmed them, or trained them on the wrong mental model, then the system itself was unsafe. Control rooms were redesigned. Alarm systems were improved. Operator training became more realistic. Full-scale simulators became required, so operators could practice emergencies before facing them in real life. 3 Mile Island taught the nuclear world that a meltdown in a commercial reactor was not just theoretical. It could happen because of something as ordinary as a stuck valve, a misleading indicator, and a room full of alarms. But containment held. The worst-case release did not happen. 7 years later, the world would see what happened when containment was not enough, when design flaws were deeper, and when secrecy made honesty dangerous. The place was Chernobyl, northern Ukraine. April 26, 1986. Reactor number 4. The reactor was an RBMK 1000, a Soviet graphite-moderated, water-cooled design. It was large and powerful. It could be refueled while operating. It used ordinary water. It fit Soviet priorities, but it had a dangerous characteristic. At low power, under certain conditions, it had a positive void coefficient. That phrase sounds technical, but the idea is simple. In the RBMK, graphite slows the neutrons. Water cools the fuel and also absorbs some neutrons. When the water boils and turns into steam, it becomes less dense. It absorbs fewer neutrons. More neutrons remain available to continue the chain reaction. So power rises. More power boils more water. More steam means more reactivity. More reactivity means still more power. It is a positive feedback loop. In many Western light water reactors, the physics works the other way. If water boils away, moderation decreases and the reaction slows. But in the RBMK, the graphite remains. The reactor can become more reactive as water turns to steam. The designers knew this. They considered it manageable through procedures and automatic systems. As long as the reactor was operated correctly within its approved limits, the risk could be controlled. That was the theory. The disaster began with a safety test. The plant wanted to know whether, during a loss of external electrical power, the spinning momentum of the turbine could keep coolant pumps running long enough for emergency diesel generators to start. In principle, the test made sense, but it had been postponed several times. There was pressure to complete it. The test was supposed to happen during the day shift, when the most prepared crew was present. But the electrical grid needed the plant to keep producing power longer than planned. By the time the test resumed, it was late at night. The night shift was on duty. They had not been fully briefed. The reactor was being taken into a dangerous operating state. The plan was to reduce power to around 700 to 1. 0 megawatts thermal. But during the power reduction, the reactor dropped far too low, to around 30 megawatts thermal. At such low power, xenon-135 built up in the fuel. Xenon-135 is a powerful neutron absorber. It poisons the reactor by soaking up neutrons. The safe response would have been to shut down and wait. But the test had already been delayed, so they tried to raise power again. To overcome the xenon poisoning, operators withdrew control rods. Too many control rods. The operating reactivity margin fell far below the required minimum. The reactor became difficult to control. It was like driving downhill with the brakes almost gone. Then there was the control rod design. The RBMK control rods had graphite tips. When a rod began entering the core, the graphite tip went in first, displacing water in the lower part of the reactor. Because graphite is a better moderator than water, this could briefly increase reactivity before the neutron-absorbing part of the rod entered and began shutting the reactor down. Under normal conditions, that effect was small, but on that night, the reactor was far from normal. Low power, xenon poisoned, too many rods withdrawn. Positive void coefficient, unstable conditions. At 1:23 in the morning, the test began. The turbine started coasting down. Coolant flow decreased. water in the core began boiling more. Because of the positive void coefficient, power began rising. The operators saw the surge and pressed AZ5, the emergency shutdown button. Every control rod began moving into the core. But the graphite tips entered first. In the lower part of the core, they briefly added reactivity at exactly the wrong moment. Instead of shutting down immediately, the reactor surged. Power rose explosively, far beyond its design limits. What followed was not a nuclear bomb explosion. It was a steam explosion, followed by another explosion. Fuel shattered. Water flashed into steam. The massive upper biological shield was blown aside. The reactor building was torn open. Graphite and fuel were thrown into the night. The graphite moderator caught fire in the open air. A radioactive plume began rising over Ukraine and Europe. 2 workers died in the immediate explosions. Then the firefighters arrived. They climbed onto roofs to fight fires caused by burning radioactive debris. Many did not know what they were standing in. Some picked up pieces of graphite with their hands. The radiation fields were strong enough to deliver lethal doses in minutes. Many of those firefighters and plant workers died within weeks from acute radiation syndrome. The Soviet response was denial and delay. The first sign that something terrible had happened came not from Moscow, but from Sweden. Workers at the Forsmark nuclear plant detected radiation on their clothing and first thought their own plant had a leak. Then they realized the radiation was coming from outside, from the east. Only then did questions begin. The nearby city of Pripyat, home to nearly 50,000 people, was not evacuated for about 36 hours. For a day and a half, children played outside while invisible fallout settled around them. When the evacuation finally came, people were told to bring documents and supplies for only a few days. Most never returned. Pripyat remains a ghost city. Apartment blocks, classrooms, streets, playgrounds, and the famous amusement park slowly being taken back by trees. The containment effort was enormous. Helicopters dropped sand, lead, clay, and boron onto the burning reactor. Miners tunneled beneath the plant. Workers built a concrete sarcophagus over the ruined core under extremely dangerous conditions. Many could work only minutes at a time. Decades later, a much larger steel structure, the new safe confinement, was slid over the old sarcophagus to contain the site for the future. Chernobyl changed the world. If 3 Mile Island damaged public confidence, Chernobyl shattered it. Fallout spread across Europe. Large areas of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia were contaminated. The disaster exposed not only a reactor failure, but the failure of a political system that could not honestly admit weakness. The RBMK's dangerous characteristics had been known. Concerns had existed. But secrecy, pride, hierarchy, and production pressure kept them from becoming the urgent warnings they should have been. After Chernobyl, the remaining RBMK reactors were modified. Control rods were changed. Operating rules were tightened. International nuclear cooperation increased. The World Association of Nuclear Operators was created because Chernobyl proved something simple. A nuclear accident anywhere becomes a nuclear concern everywhere. Radiation does not respect borders, and neither can safety. But even after Chernobyl, the story was not over. Because there was one more scenario the industry believed it understood. Not a badly designed test, not confusing instruments, not a reactor with a known dangerous coefficient, but an external event so powerful that it could overwhelm several layers of protection at once. The place was Fukushima Daiichi, a coastal nuclear power station in northeastern Japan. March 11, 2011. Japan is one of the most earthquake-prepared countries in the world. Its engineering culture takes seismic risk seriously, and when the magnitude 9.0 earthquake struck offshore, one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded, the Fukushima reactors did what they were supposed to do. The operating reactors automatically shut down. Control rods inserted. The chain reaction stopped. The earthquake knocked out the external power grid. But that was also something plants are designed for. Emergency diesel generators started. Cooling systems continued running. For a brief time, the safety systems worked. If the story had ended there, Fukushima would not be remembered as a nuclear disaster. But the earthquake had displaced an enormous volume of seawater. A tsunami was moving toward the coast. The plant's seawall had been built for a much smaller wave. The tsunami that arrived was roughly 14 to 15 meters high, far above the design basis. The ocean came over the seawall. It flooded the plant. And one of the most important details is painfully simple. Many emergency diesel generators and electrical systems were located in low areas, including basements of turbine buildings. The water reached them. The generators failed. Switchgear failed. Some batteries were also lost. Now the plant faced one of the most feared conditions in nuclear safety: station blackout, a total loss of AC electrical power. The reactors were shut down, but decay heat remained. The fuel still had to be cooled. Without pumps, water inside the reactor vessels began heating and boiling. As the water level fell, fuel rods became exposed. The zirconium cladding overheated and reacted with steam, producing hydrogen. Hydrogen accumulated in the reactor buildings. Then came the explosions. Unit 1 exploded on March 12. Unit 3 exploded on March 14. Unit 4, which had not even been operating at the time, also suffered a hydrogen explosion, likely because hydrogen migrated from Unit 3 through shared systems. The images were seen around the world. Reactor buildings blown open. Steel frames exposed. Debris scattered across the plant. Inside the crisis, Plant Superintendent Masao Yoshida and his workers faced impossible decisions with limited information. Damaged equipment, aftershocks, destroyed roads, and pressure from above. They tried to get water into the reactors by any means possible. Eventually, they used seawater. That decision effectively sacrificed the reactors. Salt water would ruin them permanently. But saving the reactors no longer mattered. Cooling the fuel mattered. Protecting the public mattered. Radioactive material was released through venting, damaged containment, and the explosions. The government evacuated people in expanding zones around the plant. Around 154,000 people were displaced. But Fukushima was different from Chernobyl. No workers died from acute radiation syndrome. Public radiation doses were generally much lower. The greatest health damage came from the evacuation itself. Stress, disruption, elderly and hospitalized. People moved under chaotic conditions. Families and communities torn apart. Thousands of disaster-related deaths were associated with the wider evacuation and disruption. That fact is painful, because it reminds us that a nuclear disaster is never only a technical event. It becomes social, psychological, political, human. From an engineering standpoint, Fukushima was a lesson about common failure. On paper, the plant had redundancy, off-site power, diesel generators, batteries, multiple units, multiple systems. But many of those safety layers shared the same vulnerability. They could all be disabled by flooding. That is the danger of common cause failure. You think you have backups, but one event can sweep away all of them if they are vulnerable in the same way. There had been evidence that larger tsunamis were possible on that coastline. Historical and geological records suggested it. A TEPCO study before the accident had considered waves in the range that eventually struck the plant. But the seawall was not raised. The diesel generators were not moved high enough. The assumptions remained. Japan's parliamentary investigation, later called Fukushima, profoundly man-made. Not because humans caused the earthquake or tsunami. They did not. But because human decisions left the plant vulnerable to a natural hazard that had been underestimated. And this brings the three great modern nuclear accidents into focus. 3 Mile Island was a failure of human factors. The hardware mostly contained the accident, but the control room misled the operators. They were overwhelmed with alarms and misunderstood the state of the reactor. Chernobyl was a failure of design and safety culture. The reactor had dangerous characteristics, and the institution around it could not openly confront them. Fukushima was a failure of imagination and defense planning. The plant survived the earthquake, but every backup system that mattered was vulnerable to the same wave. Different countries, different reactors, different decades, but the deeper pattern is the same. Nuclear accidents happen when technology, institutions, assumptions, and human behavior line up in the wrong way. A valve sticks. A sensor misleads. A test is rushed. A risk is tolerated. A seawall is too low. A warning is known but not acted upon. And because nuclear systems are complex and tightly connected, small failures can grow quickly. This does not mean nuclear power is uniquely doomed. In fact, when measured across decades, nuclear power has produced enormous amounts of electricity with a very low death rate compared with many other energy sources. Coal kills slowly through air pollution. Oil and gas bring explosions, emissions, and climate risk. Dams can fail catastrophically. Even wind and solar have small risks in manufacturing, installation, and maintenance. Nuclear accidents are rare, but when they happen, they are frightening in a special way. Radiation is invisible. It cannot be smelled. It cannot be seen. It carries the memory of weapons, war, and contamination. That makes fear understandable. But fear alone does not teach the right lesson. The real lesson is attention. Attention to design. Attention to training. Attention to inconvenient warnings. Attention to the quiet erosion of safety culture that happens when nothing has gone wrong for a long time. After 3 Mile Island, the world improved operator training, control rooms, simulators, and emergency procedures. After Chernobyl, the world focused harder on safety culture, international transparencies, and reactor design flaws that could not be hidden behind procedures. After Fukushima, regulators studied extreme external events, station blackout, flood protection, backup power, portable generators, and systems that could survive beyond the original design basis. Each disaster made the industry safer, but each lesson was paid for with something that cannot be fully restored. Lives lost, homes abandoned, families displaced, trust broken. And so the question is not simply whether nuclear technology can be made safe. The question is whether societies can remain disciplined enough to operate it safely for decades. Because nuclear power does not forgive complacency. It does not forgive assumptions that slowly harden into belief. It does not forgive safety systems that exist only on paper. It does not forgive silence when someone notices something wrong. This is why modern nuclear engineering has increasingly focused on passive safety. The idea is simple and elegant. Instead of depending only on pumps, valves, diesel generators, and perfect operator decisions, design reactors so that physics itself helps protect them. Gravity, natural circulation, thermal expansion, negative temperature feedback, water tanks placed above the reactor, systems that cool without electricity, designs where overheating naturally slows the reaction. In older reactors, safety often depended on active systems. A pump had to pump, a valve had to open, a generator had to start. A person had to understand the situation and act correctly. Passive safety tries to reduce the number of things that must go right. It asks, what if no one can act for several hours? What if power is gone? What if roads are destroyed? What if the operators are exhausted and the instruments are unclear? Can the reactor still move toward a safe state? That is the direction modern nuclear design has been moving. Not because engineers forgot the disasters, but because they remember them. They remember Windscale, where a mocked filter became essential. They remember SL1, where one rod should never have been able to destroy a reactor. They remember 3 Mile Island, where a control room full of information still failed to create understanding. They remember Chernobyl, where a dangerous reactor design met a culture that punished honesty. They remember Fukushima, where backup systems failed because they shared the same weakness. And maybe that is the most important thing to carry into the quiet at the end of this story. The history of nuclear disasters is not only about atoms, neutrons, steam, graphite, zirconium, seawalls, or containment domes. It is about attention. It is about whether people are willing to see small warnings before they become large emergencies. It is about whether institutions reward honesty more than convenience. It is about whether societies can keep caring about safety even during the long stretches when nothing goes wrong. The good news is that humanity has learned, not perfectly, never perfectly, but meaningfully. The nuclear plants operating today are watched over by people who know these stories. They know the names: SL1, Windscale, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima. They know what went wrong. They know why procedures exist. They know why redundant systems are expensive and why they are still worth building. They know that every alarm, every checklist, every backup pump, every training simulator, every emergency drill exists because somewhere, sometime, people learn the hard way what happens without them. And there is something almost peaceful in that thought. Not because the technology is harmless. It is not. But because remembering is part of safety. The quiet, ordinary work of checking instruments, questioning assumptions, testing backup systems, reporting small anomalies, and taking warnings seriously may not look dramatic. It does not make headlines, but it is one of the reasons the lights stay on. One of the reasons the water stays clean. One of the reasons the world keeps turning through the night. There is one more lesson hidden inside these stories, and it is quieter than the explosions, evacuations, damaged cores, and abandoned towns. A nuclear disaster is rarely one mistake. It is usually a chain, a design weakness that seemed acceptable, a warning that seemed unlikely, a test that was rushed, a maintenance issue that looked minor, a backup system that existed on paper but failed in the real sequence of events, a culture where people were afraid to speak clearly, a management system that rewarded schedule, production, or confidence more than caution. Each piece alone may look survivable. Together, they can become a path. That is why modern nuclear safety talks so much about defense in depth. The idea is simple but serious. Do not rely on one layer. Do not rely on one pump, one operator, one assumption, one calculation, one wall, one generator, one procedure, one perfect day. Build layers. Then test those layers. Then imagine how those layers might fail together. The most dangerous sentence in high-risk engineering may be, "This cannot happen here." Before every major accident, someone believed the system was safer than it really was. Not always foolishly. Often the belief came from real experience. The plant had operated for years. The procedure had worked before. The probability looked low. The operators were trained. The equipment was certified. The experts had signed off. But rare events do not ask whether people expected them. They only ask whether the system can survive them. That is why accident reports matter. They can be uncomfortable, technical, and painful to read. They contain diagrams, timelines, failures, alarms, doses, temperatures, decisions, and missed chances. But they are also a kind of memory. They turn tragedy into instruction. A disaster that is forgotten can happen twice. A disaster that is studied carefully may prevent something worse. This is also why the story of nuclear disasters should not become only fear. Fear can wake people up, but fear alone does not build safer systems. Safety comes from design, training, transparency, regulation, maintenance, honest reporting, emergency planning, and the humility to assume that even smart people can be surprised. The same lesson applies beyond nuclear power. Aviation, medicine, chemical plants, dams, spacecraft, and electrical grids all live with the same uncomfortable truth. Complex systems can fail in complex ways. Good systems are designed by people who know that expertise is not the same as invulnerability. That is why the quiet work matters. The inspection that finds corrosion before it spreads. The training drill that feels repetitive until the day it is needed. The operator who asks one more question. The regulator who insists on documentation. The engineer who designs for the unlikely event. Not only the normal one. Safety is often invisible when it succeeds. Nothing burns. Nothing leaks. Nothing explodes. No one runs. No headline appears. The absence of disaster can look like nothing happened. But sometimes nothing happening is the achievement. The atom did not become less powerful after these accidents. Human beings became more aware of what responsibility around that power requires. So as you rest now, maybe let the story settle into something simple. The atom is powerful. Human confidence is fragile. Safety is never finished. And the people who understand these disasters are still studying them, still teaching them, still standing watch. Good night.